Greetings and welcome to the Carl Sagan Lectureship for 2020. I'm Elise Pendall, Biogeosciences Section President, here to kick things off. This lectureship was established in 2014 and it's shared between the Biogeosciences and Planetary Sciences sections. Every year we take turns honoring a scientist who embodies Carl Sagan's interest in space exploration and planetary habitability, as well as his effective communication skills. Carl Sagan was an astronomer and a leader in establishing the field of astrobiology. Personally, I remember Carl Sagan's outspoken anti-nuclear activism in the early 1980s. And of course, all of us are familiar with his tirelessness as an educator, author, and an advocate for the Earth and space sciences. Today, we've been allocated 90 minutes for this lectureship, which includes these brief introductory remarks, the lecture itself, and a live segment, including a question and answer period and an early career panel discussion. We hope you can stay and participate for the full time. This year, we're very pleased to announce that Compton Tucker of the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center will be our speaker. He was nominated by our colleague Dennis Ojima of Colorado State University, and the nomination was supported by Dave Schimmel and Steve Running. Dennis is an ecosystem scientist who does work on climate and land use change. He's currently the president-elect of the Ecological Society of America. I now welcome Dennis Ojima, who will introduce this year's Sagan lecturer and will moderate the live segment of the program. Thank you, Dennis, for your contributions to making this year's Sagan lecture a fantastic one.
Thank you, Elise, for your welcome and opening statements for the 2020 AGU Carl Sagan Lecture. My name is Dennis Ojima, and I led the nomination team for this year's honoree, Compton James Tucker III. In addition to the lecture today, Compton also partook in a series of discussions related to his critical contributions in the Earth system sciences and the development of remote sensing techniques. He also provided a unique perspective on the influence Carl Sagan had on his scientific career. These discussions are now available on the AGU website. Compton Tucker is currently a senior Earth scientist at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland. He's a native of New Mexico. He received his bachelor's degree at Colorado State University and continued for his master's and PhD there. He received his PhD in 1975. Later in that year, he took a postdoctoral fellowship at NASA Goddard through the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. Then in 1977, he became a full-time NASA researcher. In nominating Compton Tucker, we could not imagine a more perfect candidate that encompasses the spirit and passion invoked by Carl Sagan's life's work. Throughout Compton's career, he has integrated various scientific disciplines and approaches in novel ways to expand our knowledge of the Earth's planetary metabolism and to communicate the importance of these changes he observed to the public and to policymakers, much in the way that Carl Sagan did for planetary studies. His contribution in the development of the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index in the 1970s was a fundamental way in which we viewed the Earth system. This achievement alone would be enough for one career. However, he was not able to stop there. He also led teams to develop techniques to view land cover changes across vast regions of the globe, contributed to advancements in the carbon science, and dabbled in the fields of archaeology and paleontology. Compton is also a consummate team research partner and contributor to interdisciplinary research teams nationally and internationally. For example, his collaboration with Inez Fung, Pierre Sellers, and others were able to demonstrate the role that vegetation plays in the cyclic variations of atmospheric carbon dioxide and show conclusively that these oscillations observed in the Keeling record were due not only to biological processes, but that they were quantitatively consistent with what was known about photosynthetic rates. This work was path setting for the Earth system science community and continues to be so today. His numerous accolades are indicative of the breadth of his impact on science and society. And he became an AGU fellow in 2009. He's received other national awards and recognition, including the NASA Exceptional Scientific Achievement Awards twice in 1986 and again in 1987, the William Norberg Memorial Award for Earth Sciences in 1995, the Pecora Award given by the U.S. Geological Survey, as well as the Senior Executive Presidential Rank Award for Meritorious Service in 2017. He's also received numerous accolades from international societies, including the Royal Danish Geographical Society, the Swedish Society of Anthropology and Geography, as well as the Presidential Award from Mongolia. So without further ado, please attend to his 2020 AGU Carl Sagan Lecture, which will be followed by a live Q&A session, and following that, a panel of early and mid-career researchers to have a discussion with Compton Tucker, and then with closing remarks by Margaret Torn, the Biogeosciences Section President. So thank you, and I will turn it over to Compton.
My name is Compton Tucker. I'm from the Goddard Space Flight Center, and it's my honor to present the Carl Sagan Lecture for this year's American Geophysical Union Fall Meeting. Carl Sagan inspired a range of perspectives important to Earth science, and that's what I'll cover in my presentation. Carl Sagan was intimately associated with NASA, but on the planetary side, as a planetary scientist on a number of NASA planetary missions. Missions to Venus, the outer solar system, planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, etc., as well as Viking and the Voyager missions, and last but not least, Galileo's mission, the Galileo mission to Jupiter in 1989. In 1975, in early 1975, when I was a PhD student at Colorado State University, I wrote to Carl Sagan inquiring if there were any postdoctoral fellowship opportunities in exobiology. Carl Sagan wrote back within 10 or 12 days, and this is what his letter to me said. Thank you for your recent letter. I wish there was some positive response I could give you, not only at Cornell, but at all. There are only a very few of institutions engaged in exobiology. I know of no opportunities of the sort that you seek. As soon as we find life somewhere else, I will be sure to write you back. With all good wishes, Carl Sagan. After I received this letter from Carl, I realized there were no possibilities in exobiology, so then I turned my attention to NASA. I applied for a postdoctoral position there and have been at NASA ever since. Carl Sagan was not only a scientist and a visionary, but he was an excellent communicator. Here's a picture from the Project Viking mission time of Carl Sagan and my late dear friend Jerry Soffin talking to kindergarten children about the Project Viking mission. Carl Sagan was an excellent communicator on television and the media, and he was also an interplanetary communicator with the plaques. He was instrumental in having put on Pioneer 10 and Pioneer 11 in the early 1970s, and for the Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 digital discs late in the 1970s. Many people in earth science don't realize that Carl Sagan worked for Melvin Calvin at the University of California, Berkeley as a postdoc in the early 60s, from 1960 to 1962. And Carl Sagan was very interested in the planetary of life and the origin of life in planetary systems. And there are three major earth science contributions, which I will review in my talk today. The first is the runaway greenhouse effect on Venus. The second is the nuclear winter consequence of the use of atomic weapons and the resulting climatic catastrophe. And last, but not least, is Carl Sagan's pale blue dot, his description of Earth. It's here, it's home, it's us. This is where we make our stand, and there's no suggestion that help can come from anywhere else to save us from ourselves. Let's talk about Venus and the runaway greenhouse effect on Venus. The Mariner 2 Venus mission, launched in August of 1962, had several instruments, one of which measured temperatures on Venus. We know that atmospheric composition is extremely important for planetary temperatures. We can prove this by looking at Venus, the Earth, and Mars. We know what the energy flux from the photosphere of the sun is. We propagate that to Venus, to Earth, to Mars. We know the albedo of these planets from planetary observations, and we can calculate what is absorbed. Knowing the energy which is absorbed, we can then calculate what the temperature should be at the surface of these planets. When we do this for Venus, we assume there's no atmosphere. So when we do this for Venus, we find that the planetary temperature on Venus should be about 64 degrees Fahrenheit, which would be about 17 degrees centigrade. On the Earth, we should have a temperature close to 0 Fahrenheit. And on Mars, we should have a planetary temperature of about minus 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Now we know the actual temperature on Venus, at the surface of Venus, is on the order of 860 degrees Fahrenheit or 465 degrees centigrade. Our Earth temperature is about 61, 62 degrees Fahrenheit or 16 degrees centigrade. And the temperature on Mars is very close to what is predicted in the absence of an atmosphere, because the atmosphere on Mars has been lost. This is why planetary atmospheric composition is so important. It regulates the temperature on the surface of planets. The next item of Earth science, which Carl Sagan was among the people who promoted and moved into the consciousness of people globally, is nuclear winter, or the consequences of a nuclear war in terms of the explosions of weapons and the resulting stratospheric and atmospheric dust, which would block the downwelling shortwave flux from the sun and lead to a nuclear winter situation, much colder conditions on the Earth's surface. Associated with nuclear winter and the use of nuclear weapons would be a tremendous number of fires, which would put aerosols into the atmosphere, which would contribute additionally to blocking the shortwave flux from the sun from reaching the surface. This would cool the planet and would shut off photosynthesis. Now, there are several similarities between nuclear winter and what we could expect from an asteroidal impact on the Earth. We know the age of reptiles existed for a long run, on the order of 150, 160 million years, but it ended very abruptly about 65 million years ago. In the Cretaceous, about 100 million years ago, we know that the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration was about 1,000 parts per million. There was no ice anywhere on the planet. Sea level was about 100 meters higher, and the average surface temperature was about 80 degrees Fahrenheit compared to now. The average surface temperature is about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. We have present sea level. We have the presence of ice on our planet and glaciers, sea ice, and ice sheets. And the atmospheric CO2 concentration is now about 415 parts per million. So the Cretaceous period ended abruptly, and it ended because of an asteroidal impact of an asteroid that was about 10 to 15 kilometers in diameter. And this is an illustration very graphically, which shows several of our dinosaur predecessors. And here comes the asteroid through the atmosphere. This is a reconstruction of where the asteroid hit in the Yucatan Peninsula. It was a very large impact. And this is similar to nuclear winter in that it blasted a lot of material into the stratosphere and atmosphere, which not only caused nuclear winter by blocking photosynthesis for a period of time, but it also had other consequences. This is a plot from Kring and coworkers, 2000, showing what happened, the impact on the left-hand side of the screen, you see in the red line, the temperature plot versus time. And when the impact occurred, immediately it shot up to a very high temperature. There were massive fires because of the ejecta from the impact as it came back down through the atmosphere. It warmed the atmosphere, it warmed the surface, and there were massive, massive fires globally. Then this decreased and then fell below the dotted green line into the cooler conditions. And they were cooler on the continents by 20 to 30 degrees centigrade, and the oceans were cooler by about 10 degrees centigrade. The dust in the atmosphere blocked photosynthesis for at least a year and perhaps longer. And this was from soot, sulfur dioxide, and NOx compounds. Then it gradually recovered after several years. Now, in addition to the KT impact being a nuclear winter scenario, it was also a microwave summer experience because when the temperatures increased immediately after the impact of the asteroid, surface temperatures spiked, and this was a very, very serious additional perturbation for life forms on the planet. So we went from extremely warm conditions following the impact, massive fires, to then nuclear winter as this then subsided over weeks, months, or years, which then persisted. Now, this led to the rise of the mammals because the animals which survived the KT impact were animals which could exist on detritus. It helped if you lived underground, and it also helped if you lived in estuarine or marine environments because those systems warmed less than the land systems. But the herbivores and carnivores did not fare well. Now, recently, some fascinating work has been documented by Robert De Palma and his co-workers from the Tennis site in North Dakota, where Robert De Palma and his co-workers, like David Burnham here, have found a site which is the KT impact site of the impact of that particular time. In this photograph, we have Jan Smit on the far left. In the middle back, we have Walter Alvarez. Walter Alvarez and his father Louis published a paper in 1982 on the KT impact from an asteroid, and this is now recognized as being scientific fact. So here's a picture of the four of them at the Tennis site. Now, the Tennis site is a very curious site. People had not excavated there previously because it was so confusing. But Robert De Palma took this as a challenge. And in the site, you have a conglomeration of freshwater, saltwater species, land species, vegetation, all thrown together. No sign of scavenging. So this must have happened very quickly. And one of the telling clues to this being the day of the KT impact are the presence of a multitude of microtectites in the gills of many of the fish which have been excavated there. These green objects are microtectites, and they have the chemical composition exactly of the impact site in the Yucatan. Now let's turn our attention to the pale blue dot. The pale blue dot is very significant because it puts life on our planet into a planetary and cosmic perspective. The pale blue dot originated with the launch of Voyager 1 in September of 1977. It was a planetary mission from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory for the outer planets, Saturn, Jupiter, and beyond. And this is the course of Voyager 1. It was launched from Earth. It then had an encounter with Jupiter. It then swung back around Earth, and then it went around Venus. This was necessary to increase its velocity so it could make it to Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. And then it proceeded on out to Neptune. And when it got to Neptune, it was 1990. So this mission was launched in 1977. It's still operating. And I will now talk about an image taken on Valentine's Day of 1990 from just beyond the orbit of Neptune. And this is what the image looked like. It doesn't look very spectacular. And in the center is a very pale blue dot. So this is Valentine's Day 1990 from 6 billion kilometers away from Earth. And we are looking at the pale blue dot. This is the pale blue dot. Carl Sagan poetically said, "It's here, it's home, it's us. This is where we make our stand." There's no suggestion help will come from anywhere else to save us from ourselves. We have to do this ourselves. So this is the pale blue dot. Now, this is a photograph taken from the International Space Station by my late dear friend Pierce Sellers, who was an Earth scientist and an astronaut looking at the atmospheric limb at sunrise. And so we're looking at what makes the pale blue dot pale and blue, and that is atmospheric scattering from the Earth's atmosphere. We have satellite data of a wide range of different types, which enable us to study primary production in the oceans, on land, gross primary production, the temperature, clouds, aerosols, many aspects of the cryosphere, and we can merge all of these components together in Earth system models, which enable us to numerically simulate what can happen in the future as the driving variables vary, and also what happened in the past when we know what the driving variables were. We're all in this together. This is what Carl Sagan said. We are all in this together. It includes people everywhere. Everyone who we know, who we have ever heard of, who we've ever read about, they lived on the pale blue dot. We're in this together. In addition, we have several fellow travelers, and they are the biota of the plants and the animals. And here are two charismatic giraffes. We're all in this together. We have a very unusual and unique biota, and we should preserve this. It probably occurs nowhere else, certainly in our solar system and perhaps elsewhere. It also includes the marine and aquatic species, these charismatic whales. So again, we need to be conservative with the pale blue dot and maintain the systems which support life on Earth. I'll make a transition now to climate satellites and what is being done now to conserve life as we know it on the pale blue dot. This is a conglomeration of Tyrannosaurus rex, Alfred Wegener, Professor Milankovitch, Admiral Harry Hess, Dave Keeling, and others. And these are people who are prominent in Alfred Wegener was prominent in his proposal of continental drift, which Harry Hess, as an officer in the U.S. Navy during World War II, being the captain of a ship, there was a sonar on the ship, and he left the sonar on so he could study the ocean floor in the Pacific. And he was one of the people who confirmed Alfred Wegener's hypothesis of continental drift. We know, of course, Milankovitch cycles and Professor Milankovitch, who from first principles, without the aid of numerical computers, was able to develop and show the Milankovitch cycles, which throw the Earth into ice ages and bring them out. And then we have Dave Keeling, who started the very important carbon dioxide observation measurements in the atmosphere, and a picture of the famous Keeling curve and a picture of Dave Keeling. We also see the Explorer 1 satellite, and of course, a Tyrannosaurus Rex, one of the best representatives of the age of dinosaurs. When we look at the Earth, and I study the Earth as a NASA Earth scientist, we see the Earth is warming, and this is unequivocal. We know this because sea level is rising. Sea level is probably the best indicator of whether the planet is warming or cooling. There's no change in the sun. Ocean temperatures are increasing. Surface temperatures are increasing. Atmospheric temperatures are increasing. And we know that glaciers and Arctic sea ice are melting in ice sheets. Now, ocean temperatures cannot be measured with satellites, but satellites measure everything else on this chart. We know from Confucius that we have to have proper definitions. Otherwise, logical discourse is impossible, and nothing can be accomplished without logical discourse. So therefore, we are evidence-based. We propose relationships between variables, we measure them, and we quantify this, and we evaluate it. With respect to studying the Earth, I will talk now about 3 geophysical measurements. In the balance of my talk, they are radar, gravity, and temperature. I believe no one, unless they're not rational, disbelieves radar, disbelieves gravity, or disbelieves temperature. Let's look at radar measurements of sea level. Sea level is determined very, very accurately by radar measurements in orbit on satellites. We are able to discern that sea level rise is on the order of 3 to 4 millimeters per year, or 0.3 to 0.4 centimeters per year. And we do this by using radar. Here is a plot from our colleagues at CSIRO in Australia with a plot of data from the radar altimeters starting in 1992 into 2020. And this is the sea level rise over this time. You'll notice the trend is about between 3 to 4 millimeters per year, or 3 to 4 centimeters per decade. Now, of sea level rise, about half of it is the thermal expansion of water as it warms, and the other half is glacial melt, overwhelmingly from the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica. How do we get the surface temperature, or how do we get the ocean temperatures with depth? Well, that doesn't involve satellite data. That involves a very interesting program called Argo, where we use a series of drifting floats. They're deployed from ships. They then descend very slowly to a depth of 1,000 meters, taking temperature and salinity measurements as they descend. They then drift at the depth of 1,000 meters for 9 or 10 days. After that time, they descend further to 2,000 meter depth, very slowly again. And in the process, they are continually taking periodic temperature and salinity measurements. Then they very slowly surface, again taking measurements as they ascend. When they reach the surface, they have a burst transmission of the data they have recorded to a geostationary satellite. These data then come down to Argo Central, where they're processed. On October 28th, 2020, there were just under 4,000 of these floats in operation. So there's excellent spatial coverage in all the Earth's oceans. Now, the other component of sea level rise is ice mass loss. And we can measure this in mass terms from the Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment. 2 satellites in orbit, a highly specified orbit, with a radar between them determining their distance apart to a distance accuracy of 0.001 millimeters. This enables the distance between them to be read out as an indicator of the mass variation between these 2 satellites as they orbit the Earth relative to previous measurements. So from Newton's gravitational formula, we were able to calculate what the mass would be to then result in this distance separation as these 2 satellites orbit the Earth together, vis-a-vis previous measurements. So we're able to look at mass changes from the gravity recovery and climate experiment. This has been revolutionary for the study of ice sheet volumes and for large concentrations of glaciers, like in Tidewater, Alaska, Patagonia, and other places. So this is what the GRACE data look like for Greenland. We're looking at ice mass changes. And what you see from Greenland on the left is where the changes are occurring. And on the right is a plot of the ice mass variation in gigatons per year versus time. We see an ice mass loss in the summer, an ice mass loss in the winter. That's to be expected, but we have this downward trend, and the trend is about 273 gigatons of water per year because we're measuring mass directly. For Antarctica, we see a lower rate of loss, about 120 gigatons per year, with most of the loss occurring in West Antarctica. So you're not only able to tell the overall loss, but you're able then to focus in and see which areas in both Greenland and Antarctica are losing mass. And the spatial scale of the GRACE data is on the order of 200 kilometers by 200 kilometers. Now, what is concerning about the ice mass loss in Antarctica is most of it is occurring in West Antarctica, and most of West Antarctica is grounded below sea level. So as the oceans warm, we would expect to have a greater mass loss from Antarctica, from West Antarctica versus East Antarctica. Because in East Antarctica, the glaciers or the ice sheets are grounded on land and not on land which is below sea level, as this figure shows. Now, when I get into arguments with climate change deniers, these people say, we don't believe. Well, this is not a question of belief, it's a question of physics. And I lose my patience and say, look, this is not a question of belief, it's a question of physics or geophysics. And I point out to them with respect to the GRACE data, you cannot fire a ballistic missile from point A to point B and hope that it will get to where you want it to go if you don't know the gravity field. You never hear the climate change deniers saying gravity, oh, this is a bunch of nonsense. We don't believe in it. Now we know about ice that it is nature's best thermometer because when it warms, it changes phase, it melts. This is a poem from A World Without Ice by Henry Pollack, a geophysicist at the University of Michigan. Ice asks no questions, presents no arguments, reads no newspapers, listens to no debates. It's not burdened by ideology and carries no political baggage as it changes from solid to liquid. It just melts. Now let's talk about plate tectonics and the carbon cycle. Anytime we go back in time, this figure goes back to the end of the Cretaceous period, 65 million years ago. We have to use proxies. And anytime you use proxies, you introduce more variation than what you're trying to measure. So this is a proxy reconstruction of atmospheric CO2 concentrations using fossilized stomata on leaf fossils, plankton from cores, paleosols, liverworts, boron-calcium ratios. And the data are sort of all over the place, especially the further back you go. But you get a general idea what the variation in atmospheric CO2 concentration was going from the end of the Cretaceous to now. Now we have much better surface temperature reconstructions because there we can use the isotopes of oxygen, oxygen-16 and oxygen-18. Over the same time frame, this is from Zakos et al. 2001, from 65 million years ago, we see the surface temperature has decreased from on the order of 25 degrees centigrade now down to about 16 degrees centigrade now. Now, the interest is in this reconstruction, we see that the Antarctic ice sheet started to form when the atmospheric CO2 concentration was below 450 parts per million. And the Greenland ice sheet started to form when the atmospheric CO2 concentration was about 400 parts per million. Now, Dave Keeling, who I mentioned earlier, has been making atmospheric carbon dioxide measurements This was first predicted to be of planetary interest in terms of global warming by Professor Arrhenius around 1900. But Dave Keeling, as a postdoc under Roger Revelle, started these measurements in 1958 on top of the Mauna Loa Observatory or volcano in Hawaii. And here is his iconic curve. So in October 2020, the month we just completed, the atmospheric CO2 concentration was about 410 parts per million. Now, we know from the previous slide that there's evidence to suspect that the Greenland ice sheet will become unstable at 400 parts per million. We have exceeded that, and we're on our way to approaching when it's predicted that the Antarctic ice sheet will become unstable. These are areas of concern which we should follow closely, and we should minimize our contributions of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. The first question the climate change deniers say is, well, this is a natural cycle that's caused by the sun. Well, this is complete nonsense, at least since we had satellite measurements looking at the total solar irradiance. Starting in about 1978 or so, what we see is the sun is very benign and very constant. You can make the argument that the age of dinosaurs wouldn't have existed for 160 million years if we had a variable sun, because the dinosaurs were cold-blooded, and they cannot withstand shifts in temperature like we have observed in the geological record recently in terms of the ice ages and warmer periods. And therefore, the total solar irradiance record, which we have observed recently, since we had satellites in orbit to look at the sun directly, indicates this is the case. And by conjecture, we can infer this back to previous time periods like the age of dinosaurs. Here's an iconic photograph of the Earth taken in 1968 from Apollo 8. Many people said this was the best thing that happened in 1968. It shows the Earth in the void of space. That is complemented by the pale blue dot of Carl Sagan's. It's here, it's home, it's us. This is where we make our stand. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Compton. That was wonderful. Very informative. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can.
Great. So for those in the audience, we do ask you to use the Q&A window on your presentation screen. Margaret and I will be fielding those and asking Compton questions coming from there. But I also like this to maybe start off with asking a question of Compton about, in your work looking at the Earth's metabolism, especially looking at the development of the NDVI, maybe just tell us a little bit about the type of interdisciplinary teams that you worked with in developing, sort of beyond just the discovery of the normal difference vegetation index, to how you applied it to looking at the carbon cycle of the globe.
Sure. Well, it was one of these things that I was interested in and started, and I had no idea it would work out this well. With three other coworkers, we had a small handheld instrument exercise where we studied winter wheat at the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center in 1978. Every good day, we would go out and take measurements. And we were astounded that just using radiance measurements, we could put all the data together into a time series with a normalized difference vegetation index. And so we were successful in that. And then my branch head at the time said, well, you're working for NASA. Why don't you see if you can't do this with satellites? And I'd intervened a few years earlier to get the bands changed on the imager on the polar orbiting meteorological satellites so they were discrete and didn't overlap. And the only possible satellite to get uh, frequent measurements every day or a few days was the polar orbiting meteorological satellites. And some people contacted me to come and do some work in Senegal. And I said, well, I'll try and get some satellite data and see what happens. We got some satellite data, and we were just lucky in 1981 that 70 or 80% of our data were cloud free. Um, and then we continued the work for 2 or 3 years, and we found that by numerical integration of the normalized difference vegetation index in the time domain, we could have a very good representation of total dry matter accumulation. And then as soon as we saw that, then we jumped to doing things at continental scales and then global scales. And this was one of the impetuses for NASA's mission to planet Earth and for studying vegetation. So it was completely unexpected. We were just doing a simple experiment. It worked out. People pushed us, and then we got into satellite data, and then that's what I've been doing ever since.
We have a question from Bruce Wilson. He was very excited with your talk, and many of the comments are indicating how interesting you've interwoven things. But given what you talk about your recent work, I'm thinking about what are some of the exciting possibilities that with pulling together data from small satellite constellations and seeing where we are now with the numerous sensors that we have flying around the Earth.
Well, when I started working 40 years ago with time series data, we were working at 8 kilometers. And several coworkers and I just published a paper using 50 centimeter satellite data to count individual trees over more than 1 million square kilometers, a proof of concept study in West Africa. So we use commercial satellite data for those purposes. And we have some excellent commercial satellite data which complement NASA satellite data at much coarser scales. And so a variety of different types of data can be used to study vegetation now, from the 50 centimeter scale, or 30, in some cases even down to 30 centimeter scale, up to tens of meters or kilometers in the time domain. It's really exciting because we have some excellent satellite tools and all these different spatial resolutions and time domain purposes. There are planet data at 3 to 5 meter spatial resolution every day from more than 100 different 3U CubeSat instruments. So there's just a lot of things which can be done, and it would be a lot of fun being a graduate student now to work on some of them.
We'll get into that with our early career panel in a few minutes. But I guess related to that, it's interesting that how with your interdisciplinary research and the teams that you worked with, a question from one of the participants is sort of what are some of the current enabling questions that you perceive, given sort of what you've learned so far, and you see this sort of plethora of data, questions that you have in mind that would advance the use of these remote sensing data sets, our understanding of Earth. I think we might continue this question with the early career panel as well. But it'd be great to have your thoughts on this.
My thoughts very simply are anytime you can add another dimension to what you're doing, you will be able to use whatever you're doing in different ways. And so we have a lot of two-dimensional data of the Earth's surface. When we add elevation, then we can start to deal with volumes, mass, things like that. I'm very interested to start to deal with vegetation biomass, but that will require 3 dimensions.
There's a question also about how to make this information available in a way of teaching and bringing. I guess to me, it's almost thinking about how do we excite the next generation of researchers to get into the field, and how do you make this information more accessible?
So in this paper we just published in Nature in the middle of October, where we enumerated something like 1.8 billion trees, um, we have an output data file at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory's Distributed Active Archive Center, which goes from tree number 1 to tree number 1,800,000. And you can go in and you can visualize every tree crown. Now, that was a tree crown mapping paper. Um, we hope to improve upon that over a much larger area where we can ultimately go to not only the tree crown, its specific location, link that to Google Street View if something exists, but also have an estimate of the woody biomass, the root biomass, and other biological properties of individual trees. And these data would be extremely useful for a wide range of things, either to first of all verify for ourselves if we're correct or not, and if we're not, we'll modify things so we are correct as we move forward. There's just a lot of work to be done, many interesting questions to be addressed, and these data would also contribute to ecological restoration or remediation. We're in a climate crisis. We need all the help we can get to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere.
That leads into a question from the participants asking about this relationship between government research, as you're involved with NASA, and access to sort of the research data that we have, to the commercial data sets that you utilize for the tree count information. What sort of future partnerships do you envision continuing or needed to actually address critical Earth system questions, as well as are there limitations in the current, at least in the US government regulations, on constraints on spatial resolution, other aspects that may be more arcane, given that they were written in the 1970s, some of the restrictions that you have on the type of satellite data collected and available to the public. So the connection between private-public partnership is...
Well, first of all, it's really important that we have Earth observation in the public sphere. That I think if they were in the private sphere, some nefarious people would use this to hedge agricultural markets to make a lot of money, to the detriment of all of us who didn't have access to these data. So it's very important to have some important data sets in the public domain, just so everyone knows what's going on. Now, at the moment, I believe that the spatial resolution is only restricted below 30 centimeters. Now, maybe it's even 20 or 25 centimeters by now. But these are commercial data, and the commercial data providers do an excellent job. They produce phenomenal data, and anyone has access to those data who wants to buy them. They can be quite expensive, but they have a tremendous information content. So there's this range of different types of data which people can use for various things, and it's remarkable what we can do with it.
All right. Here's a softball question for you. What do you think is the most existential threat to the Earth system?
Well, we should be on the lookout for a massive asteroid headed our way, or not even massive, but something on the order of 5 or 10 kilometers in diameter. So I think planetary defense is really important, and I hope that the Space Force will turn its attention to the asteroidal threats, and I'm sure that will occupy them, and it's extremely important for everyone. We really have to worry about the climate situation we're in. We are burning too many fossil fuels. Too much of that is accumulating in the atmosphere and warming the planet. And if we're not careful, we're going to destabilize, first of all, Greenland, the Greenland ice sheet, and then secondly, the Antarctic ice sheet, starting with West Antarctica. So we have enough things to worry about in terms of asteroids and ice sheet destabilization from our overuse of fossil fuels. These are some of the things I worry about and which drive me to drink at night.
And I guess, something that we haven't talked about, but something you've been involved with, is looking at tropical deforestation and the extent that it's occurring. And your observations were very instrumental in actually documenting that. So I don't know if you want to comment on that phenomenon.
Well, associated with biodiversity is habitat fragmentation, and satellite data are very useful for determining habitat fragmentation and habitat destruction. And our colleague Matt Hansen at the University of Maryland has done a phenomenal job on the world's forests, and we have data like this now every year. So we have a plethora and an abundance of data to tell us what's going on, where it's going on, and why things are happening. We just have to use them in an intelligent way and not fall into more destruction of the only planet we know that has life on it, the pale blue dot, because there's nowhere else. We can go, we have to improve things here, and we have to act conservatively to maintain things and not be reckless in our treatment of our home planet.
So with those assuring comments, let me pull in the panel and actually see how they might address some of these issues. On the panel today we have Leslie Ott, LMU, Gassamo, and William Smith, and really appreciate your participation in joining us. It's really, especially following Compton Tucker's talk, I've asked them to provide some few introductory remarks, but let me first say a few words of introduction about who these panelists are. Dr. Leslie Ott is an atmospheric scientist at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. She leads the carbon modeling group within the Global Modeling and Simulation Office. And her work focuses on using a combination of global models and remote sensing data to better understand the processes controlling the contemporary carbon cycle. Dr. Elemu Gassamo is an assistant professor and Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Remote Sensing at McMaster University in Ontario, Canada. His current research interests is a focus on ground and airborne and satellite remote sensing of terrestrial ecosystems and the responses to global change from the leaf and plot level all the way up to regional and global scales using long-term satellite observations. And he uses these to study plant phenology, canopy structure, and land carbon cycles. Bill Smith is an assistant professor at the University of Arizona in the School of Natural Resources and the Environment. He is a terrestrial ecosystem ecologist with specialization in multi-scale remote sensing techniques. His lab's research focuses on responses of the terrestrial biosphere to rising atmospheric CO2 concentrations, climate and land use changes across various temporal and spatial scales. And he integrates remote sensing information with field work and field network data sets, as well as utilizing ecosystem models. So we have a well-qualified panel, and I'm going to start off with Leslie, providing her perspectives on sort of the future of remote sensing and how we solve these challenges.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thanks for having all of us as part of this panel to celebrate Compton's great achievements. I want to comment on, some of the lessons we've learned from Compton's career, and just, how grateful we are as early and mid researchers to have the data sets that he's enabled us to have. Sometimes from our perspective, it's looked like we've always had global pictures of vegetation. We've all come up in an era where those were common. So we never knew what it was like to live in the dark without seeing global pictures of vegetation distributions. And it's hard to imagine that world sometimes, because we've always come, we've known that was a possibility for our whole careers. I think Tucker's work has really been transformative in providing that data set. And also just the ingenuity finding ways to capture those data on things like weather satellites and making the point that, hey, we can sometimes make use of other resources and come up with these really, really informative, transformational data sets. And you see him continuing that right now with the commercial data sets, actually counting trees, which is something we would have thought was impossible, probably even a few years ago. Another point I want to make about Tucker's work that I think is so important that not everybody else sees, but we see a lot at NASA, is how much hard work goes on behind the scenes. Sometimes it looks like satellite data just shows up for all of us and we have access to it. But there's a lot of hard work in making the agreements to get the commercial data that he's using now, coordinating between ESA and NASA so that we can actually move high resolution data sets into the kind of time domain that we have with something like Notice Reveres. And so I think there's this incredible amount of work that Tucker has done behind the scenes. So the scientific vision, but also all the legwork in making sure that we have those data sets is something that is we may not all see all the time. And lastly, I want to make sure we cover some of Tucker's other contributions. The things like paleontology and dinosaur footprints at God. He's an incredibly interesting guy for a number of reasons we don't mention. I just want to say how grateful we are to have Tucker's research that we can all build on, but also to have him as a friend and a mentor. So thank you.
Great. Lemu.
Thanks, Dennis, and thank you very much, Jim, for the nice talk. It's a great pleasure to be in the company of Jim Tucker and the other panelists who are outstanding early career researchers. I agree with what Leslie said, and like many people, Jim's earlier works inspired me to pursue my career in global remote sensing of vegetation. If I'm not mistaken, almost all of remote sensing papers in the 1980s is continental maps. One of the first maps from satellite data have Jim's name. I can't imagine how technically difficult that should be back then when computers were not as powerful as today. Jim managed not only to map vegetation activities, but also to monitor forestation and desertification in continental Africa in 1980s, and also at global scale in early 1990s. Not only that, but also Jim also expanded the application of satellite remote sensing, particularly NDVR, beyond the traditional studies of vegetation, for example, monitoring bird habitats and vector-borne diseases. So, that expanded the application of NDVI to other ecological questions. I particularly appreciate Jim's continued effort in monitoring tropical forests in Africa, where we don't have a lot of ground measurement. For example, in a globally important ecosystem such as in Congo and tropical rainforest in other African countries. I also read your recent Nature paper with Martin, where you guys actually map individual trees for vast area in Africa. So this shows also Jim is still involved in assimilating a new satellite technology, but also monitoring areas and creating a new database of land surface in areas where we don't have data. Because Jim's and DVI data record is also used, mostly used, for example, to drive ecosystem model, but it's also an end product by itself, where we can use the NVIDIA data record independently to study vegetation activity and also to monitor terrestrial ecosystem responses to different agents of global changes. So, looking forward to the future, even if we have quite advanced remote sensing technology nowadays, for example, satellite-based LiDAR and the chlorophyll fluorescence observation, I think we need to keep AVHR-based NDVI data updated annually and make it a consistent and a permanent data network. Saying that, thank you very much, Jim, for all your contribution, and I look forward for the discussion.
All right, Bill.
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, so along with everyone in my generation, Dr. Tucker has been a true inspiration, and I would really not be where I am in this field, remote sensing, global ecology, global carbon cycle science, without Jim's work. I remember I was at Colorado State University working on my master's. This was in 2007, and I had my head down, focused on leaf level photosynthesis and small scale litter decomposition studies. And that's when I first discovered some of Jim's early work. This included the landmark paper, Climate Driven Increases in Global Terrestrial Net Primary Productivity from 1982 to 1999. And the idea of using satellite observations to track changes in global scale vegetation growth, I found exhilarating, and read up all of Jim's work at that time. It led me to Steve Running's lab, where I was excited to scale up to larger scales at the University of Montana. And that was an opportunity that really changed my life and led me to some of my first interactions with Jim. So he's been a leader in the field, driving force behind so many landmark contributions. Of course, there's his work in developing the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. But also Jim has continued to inspire me personally. Since becoming an assistant professor at the University of Arizona, I've been focused on dryland remote sensing specifically. We just published a review, and in that review, we were documenting the top landmark achievements in dryland remote sensing. And of the first 5, I think Jim was lead author on 4 of those first 5 achievements, and he even bookends it with his most recent Nature paper. So he's included development of first regional estimates of dryland vegetation productivity, Tucker 1983, the first microwave-based estimates of dryland water stress, Tucker and Chowdhury in 1987, some of the first analyses of annual drivers of regional vegetation trends, 2005 paper. So finally, Jim continues to be a driving force in the field and an inspiration. Most recently with the paper we've discussed a few times now, this 2020 paper, an unexpectedly large count of trees in West Africa, West African Sahara and Sahel, published in Nature. So this paper represents one of the most recent landmark achievements in dryland remote sensing, and underscores kind of this recognition now that drylands are much more important than previously thought in the global carbon cycle, and in particular in mediating the interannual variability of atmospheric CO2 pools. So Jim contributes contributions to dryland remote sensing, global ecology, global carbon cycle science has been immeasurable, and it has truly inspired me as well as the whole next generation, I think, of large-scale ecologists. So thank you, Jim.
And he's not stopping. I mean, he's continued to work, and I think going to Lemu's point about looking at his efforts in Africa, and especially with the recent tree data that he has, it's interesting to see what sort of gradient and how effective you are with your tree analysis from semi-arid systems into the more tropical areas. Are you actually extending your work in that in the more wet zones of Africa?
Well, what we're doing right now is we have almost a tenfold expansion of what we've done, and that'll be coming out in the next 2 or 3 months.
Margaret, you wanted to.
Yeah, sorry. First, just say hello, and it's great to see everyone here. And I wondered if all those panelists could just hang up their phone. I think we're better off without the phone bridge because we're still getting a lot of echo. Thanks. Okay. Sorry, Tucker. Please continue. I want to hear about that too.
Thanks, Margaret.
No, so our Nature paper was a proof of concept paper, and we were surprised it worked out so well. So now we're expanding it almost tenfold. over 12 or 13 million square kilometers. It looks like we'll have somewhere more than 12 or 13 billion individual trees. And we're working on a viewer so people can view every tree from tree one to tree N. And then we hope to go to carbon in wood, carbon in roots, things like that. So, but there's a lot of work to be done. And for me, it's a lot of fun working with a lot of almost all younger people who have great skills, who are motivated to do their part for the pale blue dot. And that comes back to Carl Sagan and how he inspired all of us to look at the Earth in a very unique way. In fact, in a highly unique way.
Can I just add on that, or like ask a question? As one of the limitation so far we had, particularly with optical remote sensing, is that we cannot estimate, for example, net flux of carbon from ecosystem. That's mainly because we cannot estimate the stock, carbon stock, standing volume of above ground biomass, and also wood structure and wood biomass. So what do you see? For example, now we have satellite-based LiDAR, data, and ISAT2 and APC. We also have radar data. We can use those things together. So, do you think we can, by using this data and also integrating with legacy data, for example, Landsat data and high-resolution data from European satellite, so we will be able to estimate a volume or a stock of carbon, stored above ground and below ground?
Yes, I think so. You've explained it very well, that we have ISAT-2, we have JEDI. We also have a lot of commercial satellite data, which we can process in the stereo mode to get tops of canopies. We can't see the forest floor, but the combination of all of these sources of elevation data will lead us to volume and biomass and stocks, which we all know are really important. And then that will be data which we have not had heretofore. We're making a lot of progress. There are a huge number of cool things to work on. And one of the problems of starting something like I have is you can't follow up on certain things you would have liked to have continued year after year. As Pierre Sellers, our former head of Earth Science at the Goddard Space Flight Center, said he wanted to demote himself to be a postdoctoral fellow so he could work on some of the interesting things with other people. That's how I feel.
So I think
Did we lose Dennis's audio?
What's that?
Did we lose Dennis's audio?
Oh, we might have. Yeah, I just see Dennis talking, but not. I don't hear anything.
I was going to ask Leslie if she could follow up on some of the flux information given the global modeling that you're doing.
Oh yeah, good question, and it's an interesting time to be talking about global flux, and this is a year we've been monitoring global flux of carbon, and with many more eyes on us than we typically do, because people have been so interested in seeing how the human component of emissions have been changing. And I will say we spent a lot of time working on data from satellites, NASA's OCO2 satellite in particular. And I think that's another area where it's taken us a little while to learn all the quirks of the data and how to interface that with the models. But it is something where, as that data is matured, we now have a 10-year record between the Japanese and the American satellites. Now combining, those data sets together with models, we're starting to really learn some insights about tropical flux, something that we really just had this missing component of before, because we didn't have a lot of atmospheric data in the tropics to work with. So, the satellites on the carbon side have been really powerful in complementing the long-term surface data sets that we've had. But one of the things we keep going back to is that the most powerful way to use the atmospheric data is really in conjunction with all these other data sets. So we can sometimes see a change in atmospheric CO2, but we really need things like NDVI or solar-induced fluorescence to understand and attribute it. And so I think we're adding pieces to the puzzle, but we still come back to some of the really foundational work. That's still, it's amazing how fresh and new that is. And even though we keep trying to top it, some of those classics, are still incredibly relevant and foundational, even to the flux work we're doing today with all these new tools.
You're using lost Dennis's sound again.
So, what's your thoughts on advances in looking at fluxes and things?
To me?
No, actually, I was asking Bill about
Okay.
his work, Basant and Bill Parton.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I think this is a very exciting time for being a remote sensing scientist. We now have the ability to do things at flux tower level, at leaf level, aircraft level with the NEON platform. We're getting data every year at sites across the U.S. With new satellite missions now, solar-induced fluorescence was mentioned. We have multiple missions focused on thermal and potentially tracking water stress better. We have information on structural components of vegetation. I recall seeing recently Dave Schimmel's new phytologist perspective on having flux towers in the sky now, where we can monitor all these different elements. To me, that's the most exciting area moving forward. And being able to combine all these different data is, I think, kind of the frontier and the most exciting place to be. I think there's a lot of unanswered questions about all of these different data streams, and getting to a point where we can integrate the independent information that we can gather across these different platforms is, I think, a very exciting area to be in.
In addition, we're also entering an age of having diurnal remote sensing information from our geostationary platforms. And I know Compton had worked early with I guess it was the Norwegians on some of that, or the European. And,
Yes, Mediastat second generation.
and so that work continues. And then also you're doing some work now with our recent NOAA 7 or 8 platforms.
Yes, with the advanced baseline imager on the two most recent GOES editions.
So I think, to me, that as a biogeochemist, trying to really capture, the land surface fluxes of evapotranspiration, carbon, nitrogen, is really kind of exciting, especially in the carbon and the energy balance with ET. So as we look into the future, I guess what thoughts do you have on really engaging truly early career researchers? How do we get this into the K through 12 or pre-collegiate environment so that we actually grow the future researchers? Have you guys interacted with schools in your area and trying to get sort of some of the information, or just sort of the excitement that you've been involved with, the research that you do, getting out into the schools?
That certainly needs to be done, and I'm sure there are many people who are doing it. And I would like to hear from some of from the 3 younger participants in our session, what they've been doing in these regards.
I only started my lab 1 year ago, so I haven't done much of this type of work, but I'm wondering what Leslie and Bill will say.
It's tough. I think we reach out. We talk to university groups a lot. It's a really good point. We talk to people who are kind of have decided on a career path, and who are a little bit higher level a lot. So I think probably a lot of us give talks at universities all the time, or interviews to people who are interested in reading about the work we do. But it's a really interesting question about how you engage people before they make those decisions and how you reach younger people. And that, I'll admit, I think that's a struggle. That's something I'd love to learn and have more guidance on how to do. So, I'm sure we've all done a little of it, just within our families and our friends and their children. But, I think that's a real, coordinated push we need to make in the community, is how we actually tackle that at an early age. That's really important, not just for creating a good pipeline of scientists, but keeping a diversity and really broadening the pool of perspectives we bring. That's something that is a big focus for OGU, and it should be going forward.
One thing that I'd be interested to get Jim's perspective on too, what I've found kind of revolutionary in terms of getting students involved in the field is cloud computing platforms that make access to data and visualization of data really kind of easy. I remember, when I was doing a PhD master's trying to take computer science classes that were not on anything to do with ecology or remote sensing or anything, and then trying to couple that with, training in ecology. But now I think there's classes that are better geared towards that. And then with things like Google Earth Engine, ways that I know in the courses I teach, when I show those types of platforms where it's pretty easy to process data, the data is all processed. You can, in a few lines of code, visualize any part of the world you want in time series of data. To me, that's a really powerful way to, I think, engage students. So I wonder, what your views are on those types of new tools.
In no uncertain terms, our ability to process data is really important, because we have more and more data all the time to process. And high performance computing offers the ability to do things that we never would have dreamed could have been done now, say 10 or 15 years ago. The thought of using supercomputers to process satellite data, it's revolutionary. And high performance computing, artificial intelligence, various other analytical methods we can now utilize, and it represents a potential gold mine for extracting information about the coupled Earth system, the atmosphere, the land, the oceans, and how they interact, as well as many other things too. So computational capabilities, big data, Google Earth Engine, all of these aspects are very important, very useful, and I'm glad to hear that a lot of people are using them.
Maybe I can ask a follow-up question for thinking of kids especially, or actually any researcher. I wondered if you have any work you've done that you would describe as a failure, or something you started and really said, this is an epic fail. And so just to talk about taking risks and what happened next.
Okay, so one of the things which was an epic failure was we started studying the time series information associated with Ebola outbreaks. And we got some interesting results for the first 3 or 4 outbreaks, or 5 or 6 outbreaks. And then we tried to analyze the West African outbreak of a few years ago, and nothing worked out. Now, I'm actually going to go back and finish writing the paper and submit it, and just say, we tried this, it didn't work. This is as far as we got. We don't know what happened, but so it's quite common that we all have failures in what we try and do research-wise, and we usually learn from them or learn to avoid them in the future. And that was one of the big ones for me, because we were sure we would nail what the source of the West African Ebola outbreak 3 or 4 years ago was, but it didn't work out. It didn't conform to what we had found in East Africa, and it was never written up, but it will be shortly.
Right.
I think it's really important when you do something like that in a systematic way that you write it up and publish it, because maybe someone else can read it and say, God, if they only would have done this, or Jesus, they should have done that, then it'll work. And so that also contributes to our progress.
Yeah, thank you.
Other examples? No confessions?
Dennis, you should confess. Confess.
No, I mean, it's not really a failure, but it's more of maybe a research flaw where early work on looking at developing ecosystem models with the user community in mind. I think right now we're in much better shape, and it's actually work that Bill and Bill Parton are doing with Dacent, where they're working with the actual practitioners and getting the tools in the hands and getting feedback. When we initially developed our ecosystem models, it was sort of more as a research tool, and it was useful, but in trying to then look at putting that into practice and having all this great solutions, we really went nowhere until we actually engaged with the farmers and ranchers in the field and working with actual practitioners. And so communicating, more directly in sort of co-production mode has been really a useful sort of change in the research aspects that we're operating in, and we're actually learning from these managers about what is it that they need, how can we actually sharpen our research questions to address societal problems. And we should have done that earlier. It was a sort of an early recognition of our inadequacies as just a researcher. So in this sort of virtual world that we live in now, and we're working through this, has there been, in your operations, have you seen that this pandemic has hindered your interactions, in how and what way, or have they sort of sharpened your skills in this IT world and provide greater opportunities? And so what's the balance in your sort of your perspectives of how you're operating? And we're sort of fortunate because we're dealing with remote sensing data and things, but it's sort of, what are your reflections on sort of some of the hindrances that you've had to deal with and some of the opportunities that have emerged unintentionally?
I think it makes it a lot more difficult for us all to interact with our colleagues. And when you do it like this, or when you do it by telephone or by email or text messages, it's not the same with going down and talking to someone and saying, look, here's a problem. This worked. This didn't work. What do you think? What are your thoughts on it? Well, there's nothing quite like person-to-person interaction to solve problems, because we know the only people who work by themselves are people who work on theory. And all of us who work in applied areas, we have to collaborate with computer scientists, with theoreticians, mathematicians, physicists, so on and so forth, biologists. And when you can't do that, it hinders what you're doing. Unless you're working on theory, and then you're working by yourself or with a small number of people anyway.
LMU, do you have any thoughts on this?
In trying to start a lab. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. I think it's collaboration is good. The land remote sensing and carbon cycle community, I think, collaborate very well. We need data. I'm just continuing with James' last point. But we have a lot of data now from satellite data. We have a lot of sophisticated technology, but we can't pretend that we actually improve the theoretical base. We can't pretend that we are also driving new, useful, and meaningful information. In order to do that, sometimes small group research, individual research, doing research by yourself, it's quite important actually to develop, to progress the theory. Of course, we have to collaborate to share data and for model, as Jim said, also for discipline reason, because we all didn't study maths, stats, biology, or something. But if you are always doing in large collaboration or big science, it's less likely you will take high risk research. And so if you are not taking high risk research, if you are not doing high risk research, but at certain point of your career, because we all have to get job and publish and do things, then we can't progress, and we cannot develop a new theory. So that's my view on this, and I think we should also encourage individual research, small group research. People who do new and weird things, we should encourage those type of research, particularly to develop a useful and meaningful information from satellite data.
Bill, you started to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to add that the biggest struggle I've encountered is trying to maintain a lab and, students and postdocs that I feel like right now they can feel in particular, and actually myself as well, you can start to feel kind of isolated, especially if you're doing just weekly Zoom meetings. A lot of the times there's a lot of, I think, in research a lot of spontaneous things that it'd be nice to be able to go check in with somebody and have that type of interaction where you get that feedback to drive things forward and to even just build confidence and ideas. Without that, it's kind of been a difficulty in I think, being an effective mentor. So I'm hoping things get back to normal in the not too distant future.
Likewise. Leslie, do you have any thoughts on sort of lessons learned through the pandemic?
Yeah, it's been interesting. It's been a really interesting time for our group. I mentioned that we've spent years trying to develop these tools to merge models and satellite data to tell us about, carbon in the Earth system. And typically we do that in research mode, which means maybe we're operating a year or two behind, and nobody minds because it's research world. It can be a year or two behind. And since the pandemic, it's been a really interesting exercise in people caring about what you're doing outside of your normal sphere. And instead of being in research mode where we're operating, a couple years behind, now there's a lot more pressure to turn things around 1-2 months so that people can actually track carbon and how that's changing from human emissions. So that's been really interesting, in sort of putting these tools that we would put together over a number of years, really putting them into a different mode of turning data sets around. It's actually been really gratifying to see how mature some of those systems are. We've learned a lot about the things that are working well, some of the things that aren't working. One of the things that we need more information on with low latency is information on land carbon flux, right? We actually can get some quick turnaround on indicators of human activity, but we still need more information about what the vegetation is doing naturally to be able to disentangle all of the picture of carbon flux. So for us, it's been, all the challenges that everybody's mentioned, but also some really, really interesting research challenges that I'm sure are going to continue for a few months.
We're just down to our last minute, and I wanted to thank you all for your participation, and maybe turn things over to Margaret for last comments.
All right. Well, first I want to thank everyone on the panel, and we had more than 180 people join us today, and so that was really great to see. And I want to thank also the nominators. So I guess first I should thank you, Compton Jim Tucker, or Tuckaroo, as we'll say, for all your work and for a wonderful talk today, and for sort of convening this event and making it so successful. But also, I wanted to thank Dave Schimmel, Steve Running, and Dennis Ojima for nominating you, because without nominations, these things don't happen. So I want to encourage people to nominate the likely person, and probably Tucker, you are that person, very well known, very accomplished, but go ahead and think about nominating other people who maybe are doing something we don't even know about, but it's so important. So I just want to spread the word. There's a lot of really amazing work being done. And thank you also for the history of on Carl Sagan, because that was really, I don't know, I love that part, the history of science, and sharing the letter with us. I guess I'm glad that there wasn't a booming industry in extraterrestrial life research at that time. We were all benefiting from that unfortunate moment. And maybe I want to turn it over to you then, and just see if you have any last word for all of us. And thank you again.
You're all welcome. Thank you for the kind words. For me, it's been a lot of fun. Pierce Sellers summed it up very well for all of us at the Goddard Space Flight Center. We love working with our friends. Our friends are in universities all around the world. It's a lot of fun. If it wasn't fun, we wouldn't do it. But working with friends makes things worth doing, makes it easy to do. You accomplish a lot, and it's enjoyable. And so I want to thank all of you for being excellent colleagues. I've had the privilege of working with Leslie and with Dennis, but I enjoy collaborating with anyone. If we can provide any data for you, which we have, we'll be very happy to do so.
Great. And thank you, Dennis, for organizing this and the graduate seminar that preceded it, which is going to be a wonderful model for future Sagan lectures.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Great.
And with that, I think we'll close the session.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hereby closed.
Thank you, Jim.
Bye.
Goodbye, everyone. Thanks, Dennis.
Bye.